alien entered the crowded starship with the slow, cautious movements of someone who knew too well that all eyes would find her the moment she crossed the threshold of the cabin. She carried herself with dignity, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead, yet inside she felt the heavy pull of doubt and anticipation. She wanted to blend in, she wanted to be invisible, but her very being made her impossible to ignore. The ship was alive with sound before she arrived. Voices weaving together in a hum of conversation, children laughing, travelers shifting bags and adjusting seats. But when the door opened and she stepped through, a hush fell like a curtain pulled tight across. Stage heads turned one after another, and eyes widened with curiosity and discomfort. The silence did not last long, but it was sharp enough that she felt its sting against her chest. Her appearance alone was enough to hold attention. Her skin shimmered faintly in the light, not with glitter or shine but with a subtle glow like the surface of a lake under moonlight. Her eyes, large and deep, seemed to reflect more than they revealed. Her movements were graceful but unearthly, as though her body carried a rhythm different from the people around her. Some passengers looked in fascination, others in fear, and many in judgment. She scanned the cabin and saw no welcome in the faces staring back at her still. She moved forward slowly, her steps measured as though she was walking on fragile glass. The rows of seats stretched out before her, and she chose one near the wide window where the stars spilled their silver across the blackness of space. It was a seat that gave her a view and a measure of distance from the others. She lowered herself onto the seat, her hands folding in her lap, her shoulders tightening as she tried to make herself smaller. She hoped the journey would pass quickly. She hoped the distance to her next destination would feel shorter if she remained quiet and still. But already she could sense the unease building around her. It began with small shifts of movement, passengers leaning slightly away from her, clutching their bags, closer, adjusting their collars. Then the scent spread. It was the natural scent of her skin, something she never noticed on her homeworld because everyone carried it, like the air they breathed here. Though it was different, unfamiliar, and sharp, with sweet undertones that clung to the air. Around Hertha, passengers reacted with subtle expressions, noses wrinkling, lips tightening, eyes narrowing, and though none of them spoke aloud, their bodies told the story clearly. They would not sit beside her, they would not risk the closeness that the empty seats on either side demanded. She felt the space grow around her like a wall, higher and thicker with each passing second. She turned her gaze to the window, pretending to admire the stars, but her reflection in the glass betrayed the heaviness in her eyes. She had expected this, she had told herself to prepare for it. Still, the weight pressed down harder than she imagined. She wondered if every journey would feel the same, if she would always be the one who entered a room and left silence in her wake. Soon after she settled into her seat, the air around the alien seemed to shift in a way that made people restless, as if an invisible current swept through. The rows, passengers who had been laughing only moments earlier, quieted and exchanged wary glances. Some tried to be discreet, tilting their heads and whispering behind raised hands, while others simply frowned openly, as though the presence of this stranger had disrupted the fragile comfort of the journey. The source of their unease was not merely her appearance, though her shimmering skin and luminous eyes were unlike anything they had seen before. It was the scent that now filled the cabin, faint at first, then stronger the longer she sat there. It was a fragrance layered and complex, sharp and earthy, with a sweetness that clung to the air like heavy perfume. To the alien, it was a natural aroma, the very essence of her kind, a mark of identity in life. But to the passengers around her, it was alien in every sense of the word. Woman in the row behind her coughed softly, pressing a cloth to her face and muttering under her breath. Another man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, pulling his jacket tighter around himself. Though the cabin temperature had not changed, children wrinkled their noses in unison, tugging on their mother's sleeve as though asking silently why they had to sit so close to someone so different. The mother stroked their hair and gave them no answer, but her eyes slid toward the empty seats around the alien with Onis. It became clear quickly that no one would claim those seats. Every new passenger who entered the cabin hesitated upon seeing the alien. Some slowed their steps as though considering the empty space, only to keep walking, choosing to stand or search elsewhere. The empty seats became an unspoken boundary, a ring of distance, carved not by walls or barriers but by fear and unfamiliarity. The alien felt the weight of this distance pressing into her chest like a cold hand. She kept her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the window, yet her peripheral vision caught every movement, The way people recoiled slightly, the way their faces tightened as the scent spread. She remembered her home world, where the air was thick with this fragrance, where families carried it with pride, where it was never questioned or judged here, though it made her a stranger. Among strangers, she wondered if this was how it would always be to step into a place and feel the silence, follow her to walk into a crowd and feel it shift and shrink away. Her hands trembled slightly and she folded them tighter in her lap, willing herself not to betray the sadness rising in her chest. She had learned long ago that to show pain in front of others was to give them reason to push further away. The minutes stretched slow like hours. The journey had only begun yet. It already felt endless. The alien thought of home and the air she would never smell again, in the same way she thought of how something so natural to her could become the very reason no one dared to sit beside her, and for the first time, she wondered if she belonged anywhere beyond her own sky. One by one, passengers made their choices as more boarded the ship and searched for places to sit. Their eyes flickering to the rows with open space, their feet slowing as they noticed the alien seated, alone, her shimmering skin glowing faintly in the dim cabin lights. Some of them looked for only a moment before moving on, others paused longer, their brows furrowed in thought, but in the end, the result was always the same. They walked past without a word, leaving the two seats beside her, untouched. Man carrying a large pack hesitated longer than most, his gaze lingering on the emptiness next to her. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, as though debating silently, but when the faint aroma reached him, he wrinkled his nose and continued forward, muttering to himself about finding fresh air at the back of the cabin. The alien did not turn to watch him, but she heard the sound of his steps fading. She knew by now how this dance played out. The whispers grew louder around her like threads of sound weaving into a net that trapped her, even as she tried to ignore them. A pair of teenagers snickered softly, exchanging comments, too low for most to hear, but clear enough for her sharp ears. Another passenger leaned close to his companion, pointing discreetly in her direction, their voices heavy with speculation and unease. One suggested she might be carrying toxins. Another said the scent was unnatural, as if it were a sign of disease. The alien sat still, her gaze fixed on the stars beyond the window, yet her senses drank in every word, every glance, every gesture. It was not new to her. She had traveled before. She had seen the way people pulled away. She had smelled the fear in their hesitation, but something about this journey felt heavier. Perhaps it was the number of eyes watching her. Perhaps it was the silence that seemed to thicken each time. Another passenger walked past her, empty rows. She pressed her palms together tightly, the faint glow of her skin pulsing in rhythm. With her unease, she told herself to breathe slowly, to let the sound of the engines soothe her heart. But even that low, constant hum seemed distant against the weight of isolation that wrapped around her. Like a cloak, she wondered how many more hours she would endure in this invisible cage. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, signaling the shift into travel mode. Yet even in the softer glow she felt exposed, as though she were a flame in the darkness, drawing every eye against her will. She thought again of her home world, where the air smelled the same, where no one questioned the fragrance that now cast her as untouchable. It was strange to think that what once defined comfort and belonging could become a barrier stronger than steel. Among strangers at last, she shifted her posture, leaning slightly toward the window, as if the stars could shield her from the weight of rejection. Her reflection stared back at her, eyes dark and full of questions she did not know the answers to. Perhaps she never would. Perhaps this was simply the cost of carrying her heritage across the galaxy. The alien folded her hands tighter on her lap, her fingers interlacing until her knuckles glowed faintly with the soft shimmer of her skin. She kept her gaze fixed on the vast sweep of stars beyond the window. The infinite black velvet sky strewn with distant lights offered her some comfort, yet even that beauty felt far away, drowned beneath the heavy weight of the silence. Inside the cabin she could hear everything despite trying not to. Her senses were sharper than most, and the faintest whispers reached her with ease. She caught fragments of conversation, passengers leaning close to one another, speaking in hushed tones that carried more judgment than curiosity. One voice said the smell was like rotting fruit, another claimed it must be dangerous for humans to breathe. She let the words pass through her like cold wind against stone, but the cracks inside her widened with every careless remark. Loneliness had followed her on every journey since leaving her homeworld, but tonight it felt heavier than before. Perhaps because she had hoped foolishly that things would be different on this ship, perhaps because the distance from home had grown too vast for her heart to endure. She remembered the crowded gatherings in her village, where everyone smelled the same, where the fragrance of her people filled the air like music and no one recoiled or turned Away she had been surrounded, then never alone, never shunned. Her chest tightened with the memory, and she pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. The stars blurred slightly against the heat of her skin. She wondered if she had made a mistake leaving her planet. If the dream of reaching across cultures and finding new connections was nothing but an illusion. She wanted to believe in belonging. She wanted to believe in friendship, yet the evidence around her spoke only of rejection. The cabin shifted with the gentle hum of the engines, deepening their song as the vessel accelerated. Passengers adjusted themselves, some pulling blankets tighter, others leaning back to rest, but the circle of emptiness around the alien remained undisturbed, like an island no one dared to approach. She became aware that every sigh, every cough, every shuffle of movement was colored by her presence, though no one dared confront her openly. The distance was enough, the silence was enough. She closed her eyes for a moment, trying to steady her breathing, reminding herself that this isolation was not permanent, reminding herself that she had endured worse, but the ache remained stubborn. Her mind whispered doubts, telling her that this loneliness would never end, that no matter where she went, the scent she carried would mark her as different forever. And yet beneath the sadness, a spark of defiance stirred within her. She had survived long journeys before. She had stood beneath skies that were not her own, and still found strength to move forward. Perhaps she could endure this as well. Perhaps, even here, surrounded by wary faces, she could cling to hope, though fragile and small. She opened her eyes again, and looked at the stars, drawing strength from their steady light, telling herself quietly that the universe was vast, and in its vastness, there must be a place where her scent would not mean solitude. Whispers traveled through the cabin like ripples across a pond, and though no one dared to raise their voice too loud, the alien heard every word as clearly as if they had been spoken directly to her. Some voices were laced with curiosity, others with irritation, and still others with a kind of quiet fear that seemed to grow heavier the longer she sat there. Two passengers across the aisle leaned close to one another, their heads almost touching. One of them whispered about the strange shimmer of her skin, saying it looked unnatural, as though it might be a trick of light, or worse, a symptom of some hidden illness. The other muttered about the smell, his voice sharp and uneasy. He said it clung to the air like damp soil and sour fruit, and that it made him feel trapped. A young boy tugged on his mother's sleeve, pointing toward the alien, his wide eyes filled with a mixture of fear and fascination. The mother hushed him quickly, pulling his hand back to his side and offering him a toy to distract him, but the boy's gaze lingered and his nose wrinkled as though the aroma itself were a puzzle he could not solve. A pair of older travelers sitting several rows away began inventing their own story about her. They said no one could smell like that unless they carried dangerous chemicals in their blood. They speculated about toxins and contagions, their words dripping with certainty. Though they knew nothing at all, they did not realize how clearly she could hear them, how deeply each sentence struck her. The alien sat motionless, staring out the window, as though the stars could shield her from the sting of every whisper. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, her luminous eyes heavy with sorrow. She wondered how easily lies could spread among people who were afraid, how quickly imagination could turn into judgment without a shred of truth. Still, she did not move. She had learned long ago that defending herself rarely changed anything. It only made the fear grow stronger. Silence was her only shield, and though it was fragile, it was all she had left. As the minutes stretched into hours, the whispers softened, but only because they had been spoken enough times to become unspoken truths. Now, when passengers glanced at her, their eyes carried silent stories formed from rumors alone. It no longer mattered that they did not know her. It no longer mattered that her scent was harmless. What mattered was the image. They had built together a story where she was a danger, simply because she was different. To alien pressed her palms together, resting them against her knees. Her skin shimmered faintly in rhythm with her heartbeat. She told herself to endure, to breathe, to wait for the journey to end, but inside a storm brewed of sadness, frustration, and something darker, the fear that this isolation was not temporary, that it was her fate. She closed her eyes briefly and drew in a slow breath, holding it for a moment before releasing it softly. The scent that surrounded her did not fade. It never would. It was a part of her as much as her blood and her bones, and she wondered quietly if she would ever meet someone who could see it not as a curse but as a piece of who she was. Amid the restless silence of the cabin, while passengers exchanged wary glances and whispers, a human traveler noticed the alien. He had been seated several rows back, his attention on a book displayed across the thin glass of his tablet. But as the voices around him grew louder and the tension in the air thickened, he lifted his eyes and saw her. Rat First, what struck him was not the shimmer of her skin nor the faint glow of her hands, resting tightly in her lap, but the stillness in her posture. It was the kind of stillness that came not from peace, but from restraint, as though she carried a storm inside her, yet forced herself to sit calm and silent. While the world turned away from her, he watched the others react to her, some shifting uncomfortably in their seats, some whispering and pointing, others pretending to ignore her, but still leaning slightly away from her, as though distance itself could shield them from what they did not understand. The human felt something stir in him, a memory perhaps, of times when he too had been on the outside, listening to voices that spoke without care of who might be listening. The scent reached him faint at first, like an echo carried on the recycled air of the cabin. He breathed in slowly, expecting the unpleasantness others had described, yet what filled his lungs was something different. It was sharp, yes, but also earthy, grounding with a sweetness that reminded him of wet soil after a storm. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment he was no longer on the starship but back on Earth, walking barefoot across fields of grass after the rain had fallen heavy, and the sky smelled alive. When he opened his eyes again, he saw her reflection in the window, her luminous gaze fixed outward, but he could see the sadness pooling in her expression. It was the look of someone who had been judged too many times without being known. He wondered how many journeys she had endured like this, how many silent wounds she carried hidden beneath that shimmering skin. Set down his tablet and rose from his seat, the movement quiet but enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby passengers. His steps were steady as he moved down the aisle, not hurried, not hesitant. He knew the choice he was making, and he did not waver. When he reached her row, he paused only for a moment to take in the empty seats around her. Then, without hesitation, he slid into the space beside her. The sound of the seat adjusting broke the tense silence around them, and heads turned, eyes widening in surprise, as though no one could imagine why he would choose that place. But he did not look at them. He looked at her, offering the faint curve of a smile that reached his eyes. The alien turned slowly, her expression filled with disbelief, as if she had misread his intent, perhaps expecting him to move away at the last second. But he remained steady, calm, and unshaken. And in that small moment she felt something she had not felt in a long time, the fragile possibility of being seen. The alien turned her head fully now, her luminous eyes wide with surprise. She studied the human seated beside her as though unsure if he was real. Her mind raced with questions. Why had he chosen this seat? What was he seeking? Did he not sense the aroma that filled the air? She expected him to shift uncomfortably as so many others had, yet he simply settled in, as though nothing at all was wrong. The silence stretched between them, not the heavy silence of rejection she had felt before, but a lighter silence filled with possibility. He rested his hands calmly on his knees, his posture relaxed, his face open and unguarded. She waited for the hesitation, the quick glance, the excuse to move away, but it never came. Passengers nearby noticed immediately, their whispers rising again like a soft storm. Why would a human sit beside her? Did he not smell it? Could he not feel it? Was he reckless, or simply strange? Their words buzzed faintly in the background, but the human did not turn his head. He did not acknowledge them. His focus remained gently on her, as though the rest of the cabin had ceased to exist. She lowered her gaze, unable to hold his eyes for long. Her chest tightened, not with sorrow but with confusion. A question formed within her, though she did not speak it aloud. He seemed to sense it anyway. His lips curved into a smile, quiet yet certain, and his voice finally broke the fragile silence. He said that the scent reminded him of home. The words, simple yet powerful, carried across the space between them like a bridge. Her breath caught in her throat. She looked up quickly, meeting his eyes again, searching for mockery but finding none. His tone was sincere, his expression calm, his body language steady. He spoke not to comfort her, but because he truly meant it. For a long moment she could only stare, the meaning of his words weaving slowly into her heart. Home. The word echoed inside her, and for the first time on this journey, her scent was not a barrier. It was a memory, it was a connection, it was a piece of her identity that someone else recognized, not with fear but with warmth. The human inhaled again, closing his eyes briefly, as though savoring the air around her. He described how it was like the earth after rainfall, when the soil was rich and damp, when the air carried the promise of new growth, when the world felt alive. She listened intently, her hands unclenching in her lap, the shimmer of her skin softening as her body eased. The other passengers continued to whisper, but their voices no longer pierced her heart. The wall around her had cracked, not because the cabin had changed, but because one human had chosen to see her differently. She felt something stir within her, something she thought she had lost long ago, a fragile yet undeniable sense of hope. The alien sat very still, her eyes fixed on the human, as his words lingered in the air. She could feel her chest rising and falling more easily now, the weight that had pressed against her ribs. Since she entered the cabin seemed to ease. She searched his expression for any trace of mockery, yet all she found was honesty. His smile was not forced, his tone was not false. He had truly chosen to sit beside her for the first time since leaving her home. The world she allowed herself to breathe fully, drawing the air into her lungs without shame. The scent that surrounded her no longer felt like a burden but a thread that connected her to something she thought she had lost. She whispered softly, asking him why he did not turn away like the others, but her voice was fragile, almost trembling, as though she feared the answer might undo everything. The human tilted his head slightly, as though surprised by the question, and then he spoke, simply saying that he did not find the scent unpleasant to him. It was familiar, it was grounding, it carried him back to days on Earth, when the rain had fallen heavy and the soil had released its fragrance into the air. He said it reminded him of afternoons, when the world was quiet and whole, when he felt safe and at peace. She listened closely, every word soaking into her like rain into dry ground. She had carried her scent like a curse for so long that hearing someone describe it as a comfort shook her deeply. She asked him softly if others on his world shared this memory, and he nodded, saying many did, though not all noticed it the way he did. He told her that sometimes what repels one person becomes the treasure of another. Perspective could shape meaning just as surely as the stars shaped constellations. Her eyes widened slightly, and she felt the tension in her shoulders unravel piece by piece. She had never heard anyone speak of her in this way, not on the journeys she had taken, not in the places she had visited. His acceptance was not loud, not dramatic, yet it filled her with more strength than she could have imagined her on. The cabin had not changed. The passengers still whispered, their faces still twisted with suspicion, yet their voices no longer defined her in that moment. His presence became a shield, not because he silenced them but because he gave her something stronger to hold on to. She turned to the window again, but this time when she saw her reflection she did not see a figure weighed down by shame. She saw someone who had been chosen, someone who was no longer entirely alone. The alien finally allowed herself the smallest of smiles, faint but real. Her gaze softened as she whispered a thank you. Her words carried more meaning than sound could hold. They were a release of sorrow, a gesture of trust, and the beginning of something she had thought impossible, a bond forming across silence and difference. The alien sat beside the human, her smile faint but genuine, the warmth of it surprising even herself. She had forgotten what it felt like to be seen without judgment, to be acknowledged without suspicion. His presence beside her was steady, calm, and unshaken, despite the whispers that still curled like smoke through the cabin. For the first time on this long journey, she felt the space around her shift, not because the passengers had changed, but because she no longer measured her worth through their silence. She glanced at the human again, and saw no hesitation in his eyes, only kindness and a quiet strength. He had chosen this seat deliberately, and that choice meant more than words could capture. He leaned back slightly, relaxing into the seat as though it were the most natural place in the world, his breathing slow and untroubled. He told her again how the scent reminded him of Earth after the rain, how it made him feel close to home, even though he was far away among the stars. She listened carefully, each word weaving itself into her memory, as though stitching a wound that had been left open. Too long. She found herself speaking more than she expected, her voice low but steady. She told him of her planet where the air was filled with the fragrance of her people, how no one ever noticed it because it was simply part of life. She spoke of the fields that glowed softly at night, of the rivers that carried silver reflections through the valleys, of the gatherings where music and laughter rose into the sky. Her words painted fragments of a world far away yet alive within her heart. The human listened with genuine attention, nodding softly as she spoke. He asked questions not with suspicion but with curiosity. He wanted to know the names of her rivers, the sound of her music, the taste of her food. She answered slowly, her words hesitant at first but then growing with each question. His interest gave her courage, and for the first time she shared pieces of her story, without fear of rejection around them. The other passengers grew quieter, perhaps unsettled by the sight of a bond forming where they had expected only distance. Their whispers faded, replaced by uneasy silence, but the alien no longer cared. Their opinions had lost their weight. She had found something stronger than their fear. She had found connection. The stars beyond the window stretched endlessly, a canvas of light and shadow, and for the first time she looked at them Without the heaviness of isolation, she felt lighter, her heart steady, her mind calmer. She no longer felt like a shadow cast apart from the world. She felt present, she felt seen. The journey was far from over, yet the meaning of it had changed. The alien realized that belonging did not come from the approval of many, but from the acceptance of one, and in that simple truth she found peace. She turned to the human, her voice soft but steady, and said that his words had given her something she thought she had lost. She told him that now when she thought of home, she would remember this moment too, and her smile widened, not faint but full of light.